if we're not open to learning from each other, and we're just going into our corners and yelling and screaming, you are also unattractive to people who are not, involved in politics.
Yeah.
I mean, the working class should not be confused by the meaningless debates of people in the left. You want to appeal to people. You want to be an appealing political tendency. You want to have a sensibility that people say, I want to be a part of that. But if you're bickering about Bukharin or some disagreement about, Rubin's book on Marxist theory of value, you're just being an elitist, and you're
Yeah.
not capable of understanding the need to be capacious. That doesn't mean you shouldn't have principles. You
Right.
must have principles, and you mustn't just, accede to somebody's views because you're friends. Have principles, but be a decent person. You can't
Right.
build a left if you're just yelling and screaming and, tearing people down. Nobody likes that. So I think that element of, perhaps it's more on social media, but I don't think so. This is also hugely there in sectarian groups.
Right.
And also on, it's, I'm sorry to use a word like this, but it has a lot to do with maturity.
Mm.
As you get older, you understand that your minor differences with XYZ shouldn't define your political horizon.
Scooping this up like ants in a colony. Organize the wealth into a socialist economy.
Okay, so Vijay, we read through your book, and personally, I found the book to be a succinct yet thorough analysis of Cuba's turbulent relationship with its neighbor to the north. While the book is short in overall length, it masterfully condenses a number of broad topics into a compact and easily digestible package. As someone who has read numerous books on the subject of Cuba, I can say that On Cuba provides a fresh and insightful chronicling of Cuba's valiant perseverance in defiance of the colossal and unscrupulous pressure from the United States. Whether you're an experienced reader on the subject of Cuba, or this would be your introduction to the topic, On Cuba is an indispensable contribution to the analysis of one of the most impressive socialist projects in history. So we really, really enjoyed the book.
And thanks a lot. That's extremely moving. Thanks a lot.
All right, great. So just to get into some of the questions, like, obviously we want to talk about the book and the specifics of the book, but I actually just had one question, and that's like, I have to ask about your co-author, Noam Chomsky. What is it like to collaborate with one of the most renowned and high-profile political commentators of our time?
Yeah, obviously it's extremely exciting, and it's the fruit of a long relationship and friendship. I got to know him in the 1990s when I was, pretty active traveling to different places. I'm still active traveling, but I would go
I just saw
to,
you in New York.
yeah, but I would go to way more dangerous places earlier in my life when I
Mhm.
was younger, and cover wars and so on. And I found it valuable to write to him. After I sort of first began to correspond with him, I found it useful to write him an email and say, I'm in Turkey, I'm in the south east. There's Turkish planes have been bombing Kurdish positions. This is what I'm learning. And then from far away, he would give me advice. He would give me his perspective. He'd write and tell me, I was in Turkey 10 years ago, and this is what I experienced. I gave a lecture in Istanbul. So, over the years, that was our relationship. I would go to all these crazy places, to Iraq, in the middle of a war, to Libya, and I would sort of report to him personally and tell him, this is what I'm finding. And then I would, listen to his lectures, and it was interesting how he would incorporate some of the conversation, because it was his way of also learning about things from the ground. Um, the idea of the withdrawal, which is the first book we did together, came from the publisher. It was not our idea. And I was really quite ecstatic when, Noam said to me, well, why don't we do this together? Because, Iraq, Afghanistan on the ground, and I know effectively the US, foreign policy narratives and so on. I can break those down. So that was a treat. And, over the course of that book, we got into a rhythm where we would learn to talk, in our long conversations, and record them, and realize that, when two people talk, it's not actually a book. It's just two people chatting.
Mhm.
And he had the faith in me to take those transcripts of our conversation, which were thousands of pages long, and shape it into a book. And then, when we did the withdrawal, basically, that's not the exact transcript of the conversation. That would be dull because we'd be repeating things and so on. I mean, Noam Chomsky doesn't always talk in full paragraphs. He has digressions, and he has interesting, analysis that will come in, and then he goes back to points and so on. So it was useful to be able to edit it. And the withdrawal is a crafted book.
Mhm.
It's not just a transcript. And so when we decided to do this text on Cuba, I mean, he was very upset by the U.S. policy, that when the U.S. took Cuba back onto the state sponsor
Mhm.
of terrorism list. That really bothered Noam, actually. That particular act, he saw it to be excessively vindictive, and I agreed with him. We wrote a statement saying this is ridiculous, whatever. When we did that book, again, we talked for hours and hours and hours and thousands of pages of transcript, but it was really inadequate because he would say things like, well, John Adams said the following.
Mhm.
And I felt, look, in fact, people don't know about that. It would be useful to quote from Adams, to have the actual language, not when Noam will say somewhere in the thing in 61, there's a line where somebody said this. And I thought, no, wait, let's pause the manuscript and actually quote from the US State Department text or the transcript of a
Yeah.
conversation with Kennedy. So basically, what I did was I downloaded Noam's brain on Cuba, and then I went out there and filled in a lot of the gaps. And then I wrote in sections of my own experiences on the ground in Cuba. And in order to have a little more Noam than you'd get, we had those block quotes of his voice.
Mhm.
So these are crafted books, and he actually preferred that because Noam has done a lot of interview books. But if you read those books, they are not, just to be quite clear, they are actually transcripts of conversations. And you know those are harder for people to read
Mhm.
because you might as well just listen to the conversation.
Right.
A book should be crafted, and that's what we decided. Even an interview book should not be a transcript. It should be crafted because the reader must be given a certain amount of respect. That when he says, oh yeah, there was like an attack in there were so many attacks
Mhm.
against Cuba in the 60s.
Mhm.
Well, the reader wants to know what were some of them like. And
Right.
so I filled that in and said, there was this motorboat that went off the shore of a hotel and they just machine gunned the beach, and things like that, which are like, really, that stuff happened? That just doesn't seem real. And if you just leave it at, hey, listen, they did these terrible things, you don't get a granular sense of how weird some of the attacks were. So really, that's what it's like. It's a real pleasure, and it breaks my heart that Noam had a stroke right after we
Understandable.
finished working on the book, and that it breaks my heart that we can't just chat whenever I want to. He's still playing with his dog, and I go see him every once in a while. But age, old age is terrible.
Yeah. So, like, I just have one kind of a follow up question on your relationship with Noam, and I hope that it's kind of like healthy for like kind of like the left broadly to ask this question and to address it. But there's like a somewhat long-standing leftist political discourse, a rift within the discourse between the libertarian socialist and the Marxist-Leninist. Chomsky has made certain criticisms of Lenin and the Soviet Union, which, in my estimation, is somewhat of a divergence from your perspective, as evidenced by your books Red Star Over the Third World and your selected writings of Lenin. Can you describe the process of collaboration and friendship with Noam despite these disagreements on the legacy of the Soviet project? And I ask this question not to stoke the flames of leftist infighting, but on the contrary, to fight against that stereotype and use you and Noam as an example of left unity. And for the record, I find his works to be indispensable. You know, his collaborations with you, his collaborations with Elon Pape on Gaza and Palestine. Like, you know, I'm a big fan of all these works, and I think he's quite valuable. So I'm not saying this because I'm trying to get you to feed into any controversy, but I want that type of kind of immature bickering to kind of be quelled a little bit.
I probably wouldn't be here if not for the works of Noam Chomsky that are on
Exactly.
Well, there's that. I mean, look. Firstly, I would like to challenge your use of the word somewhat, because you said somewhat divergence. I mean, I think we have a fundamental divergence on the analysis of Lenin and the Soviet Union and communist history and so on. Fundamental disagreements. Yeah, but not somewhat. That's crazy. Okay. Yeah. No, and I think it's healthy to have disagreements with people that you admire. First, I just want to say that, just as you said, we wouldn't be here without somebody like that, towering influence in so many of our lives, most profound critique of the whole basis of U.S. foreign policy was conducted by Chomsky. His text, The Responsibility of Intellectuals, from God, way back, the 1970s, and 60s, his immense critiques of the US positions on Vietnam and all of that, of course. Look, I always look for commonalities rather than for differences. That's my personal view of the world. The left eats itself apart with searching for minor differences, and sometimes not so minor differences, but it eats itself apart. And I search for commonalities. And also, I believe that friendship is very important in the world of humans, not just, of intellectuals, but humans. Friendship is to be cherished and is important. I have friends who believe the exact opposite of what I believe in. I cherish my friends. I don't want to only be friends with people that are like me, because then I'm just being narcissistic, just being friends with me. I want friends who, challenge me, who entertain me. And I don't mean that I like to get into big political arguments. I have friends who are capitalists, and we discuss things, and they tell me things that I wouldn't know otherwise, about, let's say, what's happening in the world of banks. I mean, the day of the financial crisis started, that Sunday, a friend of mine who works for a very big bank in New York City called me up and said, tomorrow is going to be a shit show. And I said, why? He said that, I think one, if not two, banks are going to close. And he started telling me, not any details, it's not insider trading, I don't have capital to invest, I didn't make money on the bank, just to be quite clear. But
Heard it
he
here
was telling
first,
me,
folks.
no, he was telling me, basically what he was going through, and that they were at work, and they were looking through things, and they were looking for toxic assets in their books, and that was interesting to me, and he was heartsick by the level of toxic assets. We shared that in common. He's a human being, but we disagree fundamentally on a range of things. So I don't see I don't see any problem with that. I mean, you build commonalities, and in terms of left theory, I have huge, enormous problems with the approach of anarchism, enormous problems. But there are things to be learned from anarchists. There's something to be learned from anarchism's critique of communism. There's something to be learned. If we're not open to learning from each other, and we're just going into our corners and yelling and screaming, you are also unattractive to people who are not, involved in politics. I mean, the working class should not be confused by the meaningless debates of people in the left. You want to appeal to people. You want to be an appealing political tendency. You want to have a sensibility that people say, I want to be a part of that. But if you're bickering about Bukharin, or some disagreement about, Rubin's book on Marx's theory of value, you're just being an elitist, and you're not capable of understanding the need to be capacious. That doesn't mean you shouldn't have principles. You must have principles, and you mustn't just, accede to somebody's views because you're friends. Have principles. but be a decent person. You can't
Right.
build a left if you're just yelling and screaming and tearing people down. Nobody likes that. So I think that element of, perhaps it's more on social media, but I don't think so. This is also hugely there in sectarian groups.
Right.
And also on, I'm sorry to use a word like this, but it has a lot to do with maturity.
Mm,
As you get older, you understand that your minor differences with XYZ shouldn't define your political horizon. You
right.
need a broad horizon in order to build massive social change. And if so, yeah, Noam and I disagree about Lenin, okay?
Yeah.
But Noam respects Lenin because Lenin made a revolution.
Yeah.
A lot of people who attack Lenin didn't make a revolution. Lenin
Yeah,
did.
I'd say most. Okay, so next.
We group us up like ants in a colony. Organize the wealth into a socialist economy.